I'd like to welcome everyone to this meeting. It's an additional meeting that's been put on over Marxism. It's 150 years since the Irish Famine. Our speaker today is Pat Stack. He's from the Socialist Workers' Party Central Committee. I'm the chair. That's why I'm here. My name's Annette. Stupid, isn't it? My name's Annette Carey from Sheffield SWP. Pat will speak for about 40 minutes. We have got a smoking ban on during the course of the meeting. The exception is the speaker, so I'd ask everyone to stand by that. It's nerves. After Pat has spoken, we'll open it up for contribution. After Pat's spoken, I'll open it for discussion and contributions. We want to be finished by 5 o'clock sharp because there's a number of meetings which comrades will want to go to at 5 o'clock. When we do get onto the discussion, I will be asking people to limit their contributions to 3 minutes, and it will be 3 minutes. So that way we'll get everyone in who wants to speak. So Pat, if you'd like to...
Yes, comrades, this meeting is called 150 years, the famine 150 years since. And I want to make it clear, since one or two people have said to me, are you talking on the 150 years since, that I'm actually speaking on the famine itself. So if you came to hear a potted history of the 150 years that followed it, come to the wrong meeting. There was one thing that was absolutely clear to me as I was growing up as a child, and one thing that left an indelible mark upon me really was the impact that the potato famine had on Ireland and the way the British behaved during the potato famine. And that was taken as something of an absolute fact, that really it was the politics and policies of the British government and the landlord classes that were responsible for what happened to the vast majority of the population. And I well remember talking to someone not long after I'd come to England where they explained to me that the famine was as a result of the fact that the Irish were backward and could only eat potatoes, and being really shocked that anybody actually had this version of history. And in a sense, the things almost come full circle, because there are now, in Southern Ireland in particular, a whole section of historians, journalists, politicians and so on, who try and play down what happened in the famine, who try and say it was a natural disaster, that the British did all that they could, and so on and so forth. And it's that question that really I want to look at, and their justification for this, some of them at least, is that 150 years on, it's not very helpful to remember this given the peace process. And I think it's extremely important that we remember what happened. The famine in Ireland lasted from 1845 to essentially 1851, and it was a disaster of unimaginable proportions. 1 million people died of starvation, disease, and another 1 million emigrated from the country. That was out of a population of just over 8 million. The lasting effect is that Ireland is really the only major European country of any size that has a smaller population today than it had 150 years ago, something like 4.5 million in north and south today. Apart from the unbelievable misery of the famine also brought the depopulation that I've talked about, emigration that I've talked about, an absolute hatred of the landlord class, and an unprecedented hatred of British rule in Ireland, and gave birth ultimately to the Fenians and the next chapter of physical force republicanism in an attempt to free the country from British rule. The conquest of Ireland had seen, if we look at the Cromwellian conquest, had seen the native population, or much of the native population, driven from the land. And further, the penal laws which were introduced in 1695, 5 years after the victory of William of Orange at the Battle of the Boyne, further made life extremely difficult for the Catholic population. Among the many measures that were taken to stamp out Catholicism were those which forbade Catholics to buy land, and which legislated that those that did own land on their deaths had to divide up the land between all their sons unless the eldest son were to convert to Protestantism, in which case he'd be entitled to it all. Thus Irish society was dominated by a landlord class that was overwhelmingly Protestant, Anglo-Irish, and with many of them absentee landlords. They didn't even live in the country, occasionally visited their estates. In fact, some of them, it said, never saw the estates and the lands that they owned at all. The vast majority of the population eked out a living on the land, on plots where they grew food. They grew food to pay rent on the one hand, and they grew the potato in order to survive. 93% of the land was divided into plots of less than 30 acres. 135,314 people were living on plots of less than 1 acre. 319,000 people on plots of less than 5 acres. 252,000 people on plots of less than 15 acres. And the two reasons for this subdivision of the land were quite simply, on the one hand, for the landlords, rent was the source of their income, and therefore the more tenants they could cram into the land, the more rent they could collect. And on the other hand, there was a subdivision which went on among the native population themselves, because without land you literally could face starvation, and so therefore there was further and further subdivision between members of the family, offspring, and so on, until people were living on tiny and almost unlivable and unworkable land. The competition for land made rents very high. They were something like 80% higher than they were in England. And with such a division of land, the potato, not out of any reason of Irish backwardness, but a very simple reason of the lives which people lived, became central to the survival of the bulk of the population. All other crops grown were used to pay rent, but for people on these extremely small plots of land, the potato was easy to grow cheaply in large quantities on small plots of land, and provided an adequate subsistence. To grow any other crop of the same size, you'd have needed acreage 6-7 times the size that most of the population live on. Any year when the potato crop was poor, the poor struggled to survive, and there were cases of famines in Ireland before the Great Famine that I'm going to talk about. But the effect that took place in 1845 of the potato blight was something that was to be absolutely devastating. The blight was actually a fungus which spread rapidly when there were high levels of rainfall, and which turned entire potato fields black with an awful stench, and the potato itself became completely inedible. The very subsistence, the one means of subsistence that people had, therefore was rotting. And therefore, once it became clear that the potato had failed, it also became clear that without real government aid, Ireland was facing an unprecedented disaster. At that time, Ireland, from 1801, the Act of Union, in which the Dublin Parliament had been shut down, and Ireland was integrated fully into Great Britain, I suppose, was, to use a phrase famous by Thatcher at that stage, as British as Finchley, according to the government. How the government responded in those circumstances was to be vital. The Prime Minister of the day when the famine broke out was a Tory, Sir Robert Peel, who's more famous for having founded the police force. Peel was no friend of the Irish. He was a consistent opponent of Catholic emancipation and a supporter of harsh penal laws in Ireland. When Chief Secretary for Ireland, it was noted that he would end every official banquet by proposing a toast. He'd put his leg on one chair and would hold up his drink and say, here's to the pious, glorious and immortal memory of William III. And he thus earned the nickname in Ireland of Orange Peel as a result of this. Peel's response to what took place was, to say the least, inadequate, but actually, compared to what was to come, to what was to follow him in the Liberal government that replaced him, as I'll come on to, it could actually look like a model of generosity. Peel's response was, first of all, to abolish the corn laws, which had held the price of British corn artificially high. and he did so amidst much political opposition from his own party. He also authorised an indirect government purchase of £100,000 worth of maize, Indian corn as it was to be called at the time, to be specifically used for Ireland, and which would be thrown on the market at any time when the prices looked like they were rising, in order to draw the prices down. He also set up a relief commission which was to be headed by a government yes-man called Ralph, whose task was to raise money from landlords and also to encourage them to employ the peasantry on their estates in other forms of work in order that they might meet the crisis. He also introduced a board of works to create employment by building new roads and so on and so forth. In fact, these measures were only marginally successful. First, the repeal of the Corn Laws did drive down prices, but they were still far too expensive for most of the Irish population, and it also drove down the value of the corn that the peasants themselves were growing, and therefore greater amounts of corn had to be used to pay the landlords rent. The amount of maize that was imported, remember, as I said, £100,000 worth, was nowhere near equal to the task, especially as the total loss of the potato crop was something like £3,500,000 worth. A huge difference between what the government was offering and what the disaster that they were facing. The amount of public works could nowhere near satisfy the number of people who now desperately needed employment, nor could it be quickly put in place. It wasn't easy to put a public works in place. You needed all sorts of things like structural engineers and so on and so forth. As it was, most of the works that were put in place were farcical. They were roads to nowhere, bridges over dry ravines and so on and so forth. And works that could have created larger scale employment and perhaps helped considerably more parts of the country, such as create an extensive rail network, proper drainage systems, or building and modernising harbours, were all rejected by the government as being too expensive to introduce. The works that did exist had to be largely financed by the local rates. The rate had historically been very, very difficult to collect. Indeed, there's whole stories of the collecting of the rates having to be escorted by large numbers of soldiers and even warships off the coast of places where the rate was to be collected. And yes, this the government saw as being the main source of revenue to pay for the crisis. The fact of the matter is that the landlords, by and large, wouldn't pay the rates. The larger farmers, the native larger farmers, Catholic larger farmers and so on, wouldn't pay the rates, and the small plot holders quite simply could not pay the rates that were being demanded of them. They had absolutely nothing. And later on, those uncollectible rates were to become absolutely central, as I said, to British government policy as to how the Irish were to be fed. Finally, the maize was not only of an insufficient quantity, but also arrived late, was difficult to store, even more difficult to mill, and it needed to be milled twice to make it edible, in a country where it had never been used. The authorities tried to overcome the problem by suggesting the following: that Indian corn, in its on-ground state, affords an equally wholesome and nutritious food as when it is ground as meal. In fact, as a doctor replied, unground Indian corn is not only hard but sharp and irritating. It even pierces the intestines and is all but impossible to digest. Boiling for an hour and a half did not soften the flint-hard grain, and Indian corn in this state, eaten by half-starving people, produced agonizing pains, especially in children. It wasn't as though the myth has it that people wouldn't eat it in this state. It was that it was physically undigestible in the state that some people were suggesting it could have been. But perhaps Peel's worst contribution to the whole process was the man that he appointed in charge of the operation, Charles Edward Trevelyan, a man who became absolutely synonymous with the policy of the British and the starvation of Ireland. He was the permanent head of the Treasury. and was a complete free market liberal, and I'll come on to the free market liberalism and the impact that had. Peel's inadequate measures left many completely pauperised, but actually the numbers that died were, compared to what was to happen later, relatively small. But on the 30th of June 1846, Peel's Tories were replaced by a Liberal government led by Lord John Russell. The government was obsessed with doing anything, with intervening in any way in what it called the evils of government interference, and introduced laissez-faire economics, trusting all to free trade and market forces, that there should be no interference with the natural market process, which ultimately, they argued, would solve the problem of the Irish famine. Trevelyan, as I said, sat much happier with such policies, and in close cooperation with Sir Charles Wood, later the first Lord Halifax, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, he set about introducing this lunacy into the situation in Ireland. Within a month of taking office, it became clear to the government that the Irish potato crop was going to fail once again for a second year. And here you had a situation where the previous year's crop had failed, where much of the seed potato had been eaten, and now you had the prospect of another failure. The prospect could only be one. If the previous year, 45, had been bad, the prospect in 46 could only be one of unmitigated disaster. What was Trevelyan's response to this? He said, if government relief was still available when the people became aware, the only way to prevent the people from becoming habitually dependent on government is to bring the operation to a close. The uncertainty about the new crop only makes it more necessary. Whatever may be done hereafter, these things should be stopped now, or we run the risk of paralysing all private enterprise and having this country on you for an indefinite number of years. The Chancellor of the Exchequer strongly supports this policy. In other words, we're going to leave we're going to leave things as they are to market forces, and even cut the limited amount that had been done by the Peel government. And therefore they promptly announced that the following would happen. All government food depots, which had become crucial in 1845 to feeding sections of the population, would now be closed, apart from some special cases in the west of Ireland. That public work should continue, but would now have to be entirely paid from the local rate in Ireland. That's the uncollectible rate. Meanwhile, the export of food from Ireland was not to be hampered in any way, shape or form. And so food was being grown whilst people were starving, but the government refused to put an embargo on the exporting of that food by the landlords out of the country. As winter began to set in and all the sources of food that might still be available, berries, cabbage leaves and so forth, were all beginning to disappear, children began to die. In Skibbereen, in West Cork, 50% of the children admitted to the poorhouse died in 1 month, October 46. To make matters worse, the winter of 46-47, you can't blame the government for this, I agree, the winter of 46-47 was the worst and longest in living memory. So food was being exported. Some 700,000 people were trying to get employment with public works that had little or no funds. Little seed was available to plant for the following year in order to try and stave off another disaster. And even if the potato shouldn't fail in that year, the poorhouses couldn't cope with the numbers, and the government still failed to take any action whatsoever. They wouldn't even supply seed for the farmers to grow for the following year, because that would be creating a dependency and interfering with market forces and so on. The result was mass starvation and death. And there are two eyewitness accounts which I just want to take snippets of them to give you some sort of feeling for what it was like in the time. One eyewitness described 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, this was in Skibbereen in West Cork, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw, their sole covering what seemed a ragged horse cloth, their wretched legs hanging about naked above the knees. I approached with horror and found by a low moaning that they were still alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had once been a man. It is impossible to go through the detail. To suffice to say that in a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 such phantoms, such frightful species as no words can describe, either from famine or from fever. Their demoniacal yells are still ringing in my ear, and the horrible images are fixed upon my brain. My heart sickens at this recital. And another eyewitness account describes the following about the impact of the starvation on children. Starvation had affected the children's bones. The jawbone was so fragile and thin that a very slight pressure would force the tongue into the roof of the mouth. In Skibbereen I met children with jaws so distended that they could not speak. In Mayo the starving children had lost their voices. Many were in a stupor, characteristic of death by starvation. Yet I never heard a single child utter a cry or moan of pain. In the very act of death, still not a tear nor a cry. I have scarcely seen one try to change his or her position. 2, 3, or 4 in a bed, there they lie and die. If suffering still ever silent, unmoved. And he finally says, children were looking like little old men and women of 80 years of age, wrinkled and bent. Every trace of childish gaiety had disappeared, and even the babies were aged. An incredible process of suffering. And Trevelyan, once again, what was his response? Well, he said the following. If the Irish once find out there are any circumstances in which they can get free government grants, we shall have a system of mendacity such as the world has never seen, he wrote. This while people were starving in the way that I've just described. And he also urged Catholic priests to remind people that there was a greater purpose in life, that when they died there was a God. And he said, we must do all we can and leave the rest to God. The thought that famine was the will of God was a consolation to him, and he hoped that the Catholic priests were making this clear. It is hard upon the poor people that they should be deprived of knowing that they are suffering from an affliction of God's providence. God's providence and free market economy, of course. Despite these statements, the government was, in February 47, forced to act. It knew they would have to do something. And again, the measures were not just inadequate, but were really the key to the disaster that was to follow. Firstly, they announced soup kitchens with free soup to the really needy. Secondly, that there would be outdoor relief. Up to that point, you could only get relief, food and so on, if you were placed in a workhouse. There were not enough workhouses, and they weren't big enough to house the number of people who were facing absolute starvation. The gradual closing down, he announced, of all public works, and some hold up on the Acre Act. It's worth saying about the Acre Act that for the one chance people had of any sort of survival was that they held on to a piece of land. The Acre Act said that anybody owning more than 1/4 of an acre, which is nothing, anybody owning more than this was not entitled to relief, was not entitled to subsistence. And they would send people into the homes of the peasants and take every last thing they had, tools, whatever it was. As long as you had them, then you weren't entitled to relief. In other words, the only choice was mercy. And all of this, even these meagre measures, the soup kitchens and so on, were to be paid out of the uncollectible rates that I talked about earlier. And so, once again, the whole system, even as it was laid down, was largely inoperable, and the people continued to starve. In the following year, although the crop improved, there was so little seed had been planted that the misery continued. And of course now you had an accumulation of misery, an accumulation of famine, which meant that each year the misery was worse than the last. The government at this point, in 1848, however, there was a complete failure of the crop once again, and with it that failure brought complete and final ruin. And how did the British government treat this area that was as British as Finchley in these circumstances? the government decided that nothing could be done. With people facing absolute starvation, with a third year out of 4 of a failed potato crop, and with in reality 4 straight years of famine, they decided they would close the soup kitchens. They would withdraw all aid, bar 200 children. Lord John Russell said, "I won't let the children starve." 200,000 children, were to be fed. By October 48, he'd gone back on his word, and the aid to the 200,000 starving children was also withdrawn. One of the cases made by the revisionist historians is that the British government did as much as it could, or at least if it didn't do as much as it could, it did as much as any major European government would have done at the time. Now, I just want to quote a source who disputes that. The Lord Lieutenant of Ireland at the time, the British government's man, Lord Clarendon, eventually was so horrified by what was taking place around him, although it didn't stop him having banquets and parties and so on and so forth, but nevertheless he did feel compelled to write to Lord John Russell. "Surely this is a state of things to justify you asking the House of Commons for an advance. For I don't think there is another legislature, Parliament, you know the thing, yeah, in Europe that would disregard such suffering as now exists in the west of Ireland, or coldly persist in such a policy of extermination." That was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland's comment on what the revisionist historians now think was as good as anybody could have expected. To add to the misery, and one of the things that always happens when there is famine, there were 2 other great disasters, both as a result of the famine. The first was typhus. The poverty, the dirt, and the starvation meant that it spread to kill hundreds of thousands of people. It was carried through head lice in the main, and in the main was incurable. There were insufficient hospitals to deal with it. People were dying in the streets. People were pouring out of the countryside into towns, so that areas, actually even in the north of Ireland, which I didn't say was largely excluded, or at least the northeast of Ireland, which was largely excluded, actually the typhus raged in Belfast, it raged in Dublin, and so on and so forth. The one consolation is it's been written that proportionately it killed more rich people than poor, so at least some of them got their comeuppance. They were apparently less resistant to the typhus than people who had to live in the misery and squalor all along. Again, little or nothing was done, as I say, by the government. The second thing was emigration, to both Britain and to America. The main port through actually was both. Previous emigration, there had been previous emigration. There had been a steady growth of emigration from Ireland, particularly to America. There had been a Protestant outpouring sometime earlier, and then a gradual growth of people leaving. But there was a real difference. The people who left in the earlier periods, the pre-famine periods, by and large left with an ambition, with a dream, with certain skills, with some sort of idea of what they wanted to achieve when they got there. This emigration, which began in earnest in 1847, was completely different. It was the emigration of the desperate. The emigration of the desperate that meant that many of them were dying as they walked on board the ships, that the ships themselves were ill-equipped with insufficient rations of food or water, that many people literally on walking onto those ships were walking onto what became known as coffin ships. Emigrants who clearly were suffering from typhus were allowed onto the ships, so that many of the ships became floating disease carriers. Thousands upon thousands died. There's terrible descriptions of the ships arriving in Canada, where there are still plaques today to make the note of the people that died, where the doctors would go on board and half the passengers would be dead, and about another third dying in the process of dying. And even many of those that looked healthy had actually picked up the typhus. The ships were another, if you like, means of death of death for very large numbers. And the landlords actually used, because in the past they may have been happy to populate their land heavily with peasants and collect lots of rent, but peasants without rent were of no use whatsoever, and therefore the landlords would frequently pile their tenants onto the ships with promises that there'd be an agent waiting at the other end, that they'd be looked after, etc. They were sent on, many of them in dead and dying states, to arrive with absolutely nothing waiting for them. And there's one Canadian official sent back a protest in which he particularly singled out a man who was to become the Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, as one of the worst offenders of the Irish landlords, who had sent wretches, he said, onto ships that they should never have been allowed on, and that most of them couldn't possibly have expected to live. And one landlord described the process of getting rid of the peasantry in this way. I got rid of crime and distress for £3, 10 shillings a head, is how he described the process of sending such people to their deaths. To add to all this misery, the behaviour of the landlords themselves back in Ireland added, if you like, the icing on the cake of absolute misery and despair which took place. Whilst there were a handful of exceptions, you know, there was the famous good landlords, but the fact that people could name them meant they were few and far between, and the fact that in reality their lives continued to be very different in the main to the lives of the people that they were being good to. But nevertheless, there were a few exceptions, it said, but most of them failed to help their tenants in any way whatsoever. And even worse than that, compounded the misery by carrying out the evictions of tenants, essentially passing a sentence of death upon them. The one hope you had of living was you had a bit of land and maybe next year the crop would grow and maybe you could get something out of it. Now you had nothing, and there are descriptions of people in the middle of winter being thrown out of their hovels, which were then smashed down by the army, the British army, and so on. And they would pull bits of materials over themselves and so on, just to try and lie there for the night. These would be torn off them, and they would be hunted out of the area altogether. Something like 500,000 families were evicted by the landlords. Many of them in the bitter winter, as I say, of 46, 47. And they were done so also, as I say, at the gunpoint largely of the British Army. The landlords became absolutely despised. Just to take two examples, Major Mahon in Roscommon, who is actually recorded as being one of the better landlords, which is interesting, because when you begin to think of what a good landlord was, Mahon put 810 tenants on an emigrant ship, although it's said that he did provide them with some means, and and he threw a further 3,006 tenants from his land. There was a story that one of his ships had sunk, and a young man, believing his girlfriend had drowned, shot and killed Mahon, to the delight of the local population. There's a fascinating little story, really. Mahon appeared that morning to address the tenants in what he was doing for them when he wasn't evicting them, and they all politely clapped and said, you know, well done, Captain, and so on. But actually, once he was shot, the description, if I can find it, I don't seem to be able to. Where is it? Yeah, here it is. The description was that having cheered him that morning, the exultation of the country people at his death was general and undisguised. As soon as it was dark, signal was given of the deed having been perpetrated. By lighting straw upon some of the hills in the neighbourhood in Stokerstown, and on the following evening, when the people were better prepared, bonfires were to be seen for many miles around to celebrate the death of the landlord. And this was one of the better landlords, as I reminded you. An eyewitness account of a young man who, having travelled to America with his wife died when he got there, and again you get the feeling of the absolute hatred of the landlords. The husband buried his wife, and after the grave was filled up by the husband, he placed 2 shovels in the form of a cross and said, "By that cross, Mary, I swear to avenge your death, and as soon as I earn the price of my passage home, I'll go back and shoot the man that murdered you. And that is the landlord. This absolute detestation of what the landlords had done, clearly sentencing people to their deaths and so on. There's even an account of a British soldier, a Captain Kennedy, by then Sir Arthur Kennedy, many years later describing it. And he says, I can tell you, he says to Lord Carnarvon, I can tell you, my lord, that there were days in that western country when I came back from some scene of eviction, so maddened by the sights of hunger and misery I had seen in the day's work, that I felt disposed to take the gun from behind my door and shoot the first landlord I met. And that was a British soldier, a British officer, just witnessing what the landlords were asking them to do. In all this, therefore, despite the absolute misery, there was a level of resistance. In the main, people were too desperate, too weak to fight. Starvation is certainly no friend of revolution. But nevertheless, there were fights. There were estates attacked, burned to the ground. There were landlords and agents shot. There was attacks on the convoys, taking the food out of the country, and all of the exports in the end had to be taken out under armed guard with British naval protection also. And there was also one serious attempt at a rising led by members of Young Ireland, who had been a breakaway from the Irish repeal movement, a movement which had been led by a man called Daniel O'Connell, a right-wing nationalist of the worst sort, who completely ridiculously is called the Great Liberator, since he's nothing of the sort, who had fought around the question of of Catholic emancipation and also repeal of the Act of the Union, but who believed profoundly that there could and must be no violent act, and to do so, and he absolutely hated the Chartist movement in Britain. Young Ireland were different. Sections of them, there was divisions between them, but sections of them were extremely militant and believed profoundly in the need for revolution, to rid Britain of the cause of the famine, Ireland of the cause of the famine, British rule. And that wing in particular was represented by two people, John Mitchell and James Fintan Lawler, who were, if you like, the radical end, the most revolutionary end of the movement. Mitchell, in his jail journal, some 6 years after the famine, wrote the following: At the end of 6 years I can set down these things calmly, but to see them might have driven a wise man mad. How families, when all was eaten and no hope left, took their last look at the sun, built up their cottage doors, that none might see them die, nor hear their groans, and were found weeks afterwards, skeletons on their own hearths. How the law was vindicated all this while, how the Arms Bill was diligently put into force, and many examples were made, how the starving were transported for stealing vegetables, were thrown out of the country for stealing vegetables. And at one point a chance, not necessarily of a victorious rising, but certainly a serious rising and a serious challenge did appear to be in place. Mitchell had been arrested for his writings and for his challenging the British. He was sentenced with transportation, and there was to be an attempt to rescue him, which was seen as many as the spark that could light off the struggle in Dublin, provoking a confrontation and so on. Unfortunately, the more moderate wing of the movement cancelled the attempt to rescue Mitchell, and the moment passed. And then they themselves, the more moderates, Mitchell was out of the country, launched a fairly farcical rising, which included things like not chopping down trees for barricades without the permission of the landlords on whose land the trees were on. You could tell this wasn't really a rising going very far, and indeed it didn't go very far. It ended up in the Widow McCormack's cabbage patch, where the people making the rising surrendered with little or no resistance being put up. So, who was to blame for the potato famine? There was an old Irish saying that said, God gave us the potato blight, but the English gave us the famine. And there's no doubt that the behaviour of the landlords was to play a significant part. And it can be added that the behaviour of actually Catholic bigger farmers also leaves much to be desired, and many of them became much bigger farmers as a result of the clearances that were to take place, all this land being freed up and so on. But the British government's role was undoubtedly the crucial one, and it's precisely that role that a school of Irish revisionist historians, as I said at the beginning, are trying to play down. And what do they say? There's a man, Roy Foster. I've got a book called Modern Ireland. Ooh, somebody doesn't like him. And really, if you read the chapter on the famine, it's almost like an exercise in slipping it out of history. It wasn't of great significance. It wasn't the main reason of depopulating the country. Emigration was already taking place, and therefore this didn't have a significant impact. People would have left anyway. The government was behaving little differently to any contemporary European government. That the amount spent was generous, but that they were trapped by the mad economic theories of laissez-faire, the mad liberal theories and so on, that the government mustn't intervene. And the fact that it was Ireland starving was no different than if it had been England or Scotland and so on. In other words, there was nothing specific about this. Do these theories stand up? Well, the first two, there's no question on the depopulation of the country. The rapid rate is unimaginable. To see a population fall by something like a third in the space of 2 or 3 years, there's been no emigration of that sort that I'm aware of. The question, as I say, of whether the British government were any different to any other European government, I think we'll leave the answer of that one to Lord Clarendon. What are the argument that the fact it was Ireland was fairly irrelevant, and that, you know, part of the Irish national myth is that somehow Ireland was being victimised? I just want to... The fact of the matter is that the newspapers, politicians, speeches and statements... newspapers, politicians, speeches and statements from the aristocracy all completely contradict this notion that because it was Ireland didn't make a difference to the policy of the British. Just if I can just give you a few examples. Punch, you know, the magazine that doesn't exist anymore, used to publish cartoons week after week depicting the Irishman as a filthy, brutal creature, an assassin and a murderer, begging for money under the pretense of buying food to spend on weapons. With the money they get from our relief funds, they buy arms. People starving to death, and this was being written. Trevelyan wrote the following: the great evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the Irish people. Again, another quote, the master of Balliol recalls the day he came to hate political economists, when one said, he said that he feared the famine of 1848 in Ireland would not kill more than 1 million people, and that would scarcely be enough to do much good. The political economist in question was Nassau Senior, one of the government's advisors on economic affairs. And finally, a quote from a duke, let's do the whole stratum, in which he said, I understand that rotten potatoes and seaweed, or even green grass properly mixed, afford a very wholesome and nutritious food. We all know that Irishmen can live upon anything, and there is plenty of grass in the fields even if the potatoes should fail. Those were the statements that were being brought out. What about the generous amount of money that the British spent? Well, let's contrast it with two things. The total government expenditure was 7 million. Contrast that with the 20 million that was spent in compensation to after the end of slavery in the West Indies. Not to the slaves, you understand, to the slave owners. 20 million the government paid out. And a few years later, 70 million was spent upon the Crimean War. That tells you that what was being spent was far from generous, which leaves us with one final argument, which is the argument about the market and so on. The people were caught in this political orthodoxy, and indeed people with this political orthodoxy are fairly frightening people. People who believe, you know, the market will solve it all, leave it to market forces, and even the rigours of competition and so on and so forth. I mean, one only has to look at Redwood over the last few weeks to have a horrid feeling running down the back of your spine. that therefore there's no question that the fact that they wouldn't intervene on the basis of these policies was devastating. The banning of exports, which probably wouldn't actually, as was previously believed, have fed the whole country, but certainly could have saved tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands from starving. And there's no doubt also that the fact that they didn't interfere with the life of the rich meant a life of luxury was lived by a section of Irish society at the same time as people starved to death. There was even a lavish royal visit from Queen Victoria in 1849. There were abundances of rich foods and so on available in the country. There is no question, therefore, that the policy of the government was fundamentally one which led to the disaster. Yet the orthodoxy itself, to say, well, it was the political orthodoxy of the day, it didn't spring out of air. It existed to aid and justify the class who held power, privilege and wealth within society. It almost certainly would have been dropped if necessity had dictated it in an English context or in the context of war. There's no question they'd have dropped it. They wouldn't have sat there saying, oh, we can't spend money if we're going to fight the Spaniards or the French or whoever it is. Leave it to market forces. The truth of the matter is there was no great need on behalf of the British to save the Irish poor. That they posed little real threat while they were starving, that they carried no electoral weight within British society, that they were despised and anyway were seen as overpopulated, and that the way they worked the land was seen as inefficient. Britain may not have created the famine, but the truth of the matter is it had little to do. Sorry, Britain did create, may not have intentionally engineered the famine of the land to them once the famine was underway. Marx once described how in the conquest of Cromwell, hundreds of thousands of Catholics were replaced on the land, supplanted by Protestants, and after the famine, that Britain supplanted them with cattle. And the reality is that was the situation. And when people say to us today that actually we should forget what happened, I think what we have to say is something absolutely devastating happened. It happened structured to the theory of the government not intervening. It happened structured to the existence of British imperialism in Ireland. And far from being something we should forget, it's something we should remember, something we should recount, and something we should retell as a challenge to the completely biased version of history which says that somehow the famine was the fault of the Irish.
Right, I'm going to call Willie Cummings and he'll be followed by Conor Keneally. Before I do that, if John Marie Aerts is here, that's A-E-R-T-S, will you go to the creche straight away and fetch Jacob? So, Willie Cummings.
Initially, a very brief point. It's interesting that when Prince Charles came over there to Ireland a couple of weeks ago, that one of the places that, having done all his official visits, one of the places he then went along to was a deserted part of West Mayo. And the reason why it's deserted is because it was one of the areas most badly affected by the famine, and it's now an area which is sort of a pleasure hunting ground, hunting and fishing ground, and this was the area that Prince Charles went for his entertainment. But that's not really the main point I wanted to make. The main point I wanted to make was really about one of the effects of the famine, because, I mean, probably the image that most comrades have of Ireland is of the whole strength of the church, the power of the church. And really the power of the church in Ireland stems directly, really, it was from the famine and the subsequent agitation around the Land League. If you look in Ireland pre-famine, Ireland had very similar society to most other peasant societies. The level of illegitimacy, the level of anti-clericalism in Ireland was actually very similar to most other European peasants. After the famine, you had the huge depopulation, and suddenly you had the growth of a stable peasantry. And in the situation of a stable peasantry, the issue of legitimacy, sort of late marriages because the land hasn't been passed on to you, all becomes incredibly important. And in the 20 years from the 1850 to the 1880s, the number of priests in Ireland grew by 60, 70, 80, nearly 100%. The figures escape me at the moment, but massive growth in the numbers of priests. Even in the very late stages of the famine, they were building huge cathedrals. There's the cathedral in Killarney was actually built in 1850, which was just at the very end of the period of the famine. And what it represented was the beginnings of a stable sort of peasantry that had an interest in the land. And I think it's only now that that's beginning to break down. And all this is very important to emphasise, because sometimes people say, well, the Irish are religious because it's superstition. It isn't. There is a real material basis for the power of the Church in Ireland. And what's changed now is the shift from the rural areas to urban areas. Now in Ireland, most people live in the cities, and you can see very dramatically the changes. There's been the whole issue around the X case, the 14-year-old girl who was injunctive when she wanted to go over for an abortion in Britain here a couple of years ago. And when I was coming over yesterday, I was reading that Ireland now has the highest rate of illegitimacy in Europe, which is hardly the sort of the image of a priest-ridden society that we often have the impression of. So I think it's an important sort of byproduct of the famine. It isn't to take away from what Pat was saying.
Right. Conor will be followed by John Walsh.
Just to reiterate the point that the last comrade had made, because if anybody visits Ireland, you will notice that there are these huge churches, and they're really big, ugly monstrosities, similar to Stalinist architecture in Moscow, and essentially because the church, there was a huge spate of church building right after the famine, because before the famine, the mass attendance figures and that were extremely low, and this was obviously a cause of worry for the church. So it actually took quite a conscious attempt by the church itself to get Catholics going to mass again, and to do that they actually had to build large churches to accommodate the numbers. Just one other point as well that Pat was mentioning, Roy Foster. This historian has actually claimed that only 400,000 died from the famine, when in fact the real figure, is about 1.5 million. And in spite of the attempts by revisionist historians to drum this into our heads and so on, you will get actually quite a few academic historians, such as Professor Joe Lee, who even they'll argue that the real figure was 1.5 million. That this wasn't just the invention of nationalists and so on. And it's important to emphasise that, as Pat said, because it just lets the British government off the hook if you can just reduce the figures like that.
John Walsh will be followed by, I don't know if it's Kevin Flynn or Kerry Flynn.
Yeah, I don't usually get into language politics, but there wasn't actually a famine in Ireland. What there was an enforced starvation and a Holocaust. It wasn't a famine, it was enforced, as Pat said. And these revisionists, the agenda that they have is to maintain the system of capitalism that exists now. So when you look back to the famine, if you examine it as a socialist, you see there are two main reasons behind it. First was capitalist, it was because of the market. The second was the racial element. And you have to draw that comparison with starvation in the world today. You have to look at what's happening in the so-called developed and the third world. And so the reason people are starving isn't because they can't produce food, it's because the West won't send them food. During Live Aid, when Live Aid was happening, we were all giving money to feed people in Africa, there was boats off the coast of America dumping grain in the sea. You have to draw the comparisons between the history of the Irish famine and the famine today, and you have to shift the agenda onto our side. Tell the revisionists there was no famine, there's no forced starvation, there's no forced starvation going now, and the only way to stop it is a revolution.
Right, Kerry Flynn will be followed by Chris Banbury. Banbury will be followed by Ken Mulhern.
The question is, why the revisionism? Why is there a whole generation of historians in Ireland itself arguing that, first of all, the British weren't really responsible for the famine, and actually the sub-agenda of that is that, secondly, British rule wasn't such a bad thing in itself, and thirdly, Irish historians taking as their main aim, as the main culprits in Ireland, Irish nationalism. And it's an interesting question. The answer, one, is quite simple. This is a generation post-1969 who see the priority as attacking the Republican movement as it exists today and the Republican struggle. And therefore it is an imperative to play down the famine and to play down the record of British colonialism, British imperialism in Ireland in order to undercut any justification for people taking up arms or resisting British rule inside Ireland today. And that's crudely the sub-agenda of what these people are. Foster, Lee, etc. That is their priority. They are ideological and they're clear about it. The second thing, as the speaker before me just said as well, it also reflects their ideas. These people accept free market ideology, and Pat is absolutely right to make the link with John Redwood, John Major, and all the rest of it. 19th century liberalism had nothing to do with individual freedom. They didn't believe in individual freedom. They believed in authoritarian political rule with the free market. Just as the Tories today believe in authoritarian free rule with the market. It's not about freedom for the individual, which is actually something 19th century liberals and Tories today would deny. That individuals like the Irish population or British working class people have any basic rights and have any demands on it. And thirdly then you've got to turn around and say is, why is it that actually the famine, the starvation, was a hidden question in Ireland itself? There is to my knowledge one museum, which is an unofficial museum, to the question of what happened in the 1840s. You can go through the museums in Dublin, the National Museum, you'll find nothing on it. And the answer to that is goes on to something else, which is actually the people who run the Irish Republic today, the Irish ruling class, originate out of the post-famine settlement. The Gombe men who bought up the land, the people who actually became the rich farmers, the people who actually sold the goods, the rest of it, the Catholic hierarchy, for the reasons have just been said, became the Catholic middle class in the second half of the 19th century, who became the Catholic ruling class today. That's where they come from. Their ideology was the ideology of right-wing Catholic nationalism, Daniel O'Connell, etc., who more or less echoed the British in saying, don't fight back, starve to death, respect the land. And one of the tragedies, I'll just end by saying this as well, as you look at the Republican movement at the time, the Young Ireland movement, the problem was there was rebellion against it, but actually it's a rebellion, if you like, simply in the question of breaking the link, almost the exclusion of identifying the fight for Irish independence in 1848 with the social questions. I mean, it's almost unbelievable to have a nationalist uprising in the midst of the famine zone which doesn't talk about what was happening in terms of starvation. Simply talks about it and goes on about respecting free rights. And I don't want to kind of an axe to grind, but it says something else about the nature of Republican politics. At the end of the day, there may be a difference between them and the right-wing nationalist tradition in Ireland. The right-wing nationalists might hang them, it might shoot them, as it's done all the time. But the trouble is the Republicans are connected to them because the aim at the end of the day is simple. They share a common interest. National unity, get rid of whatever it is. And they are attached to the coattails of the right-wing nationalism. And therefore, it's a long way coming around to it, but you see it today. Jerry Adams is actually wandering down the Falls Road with the leader of Fianna Fáil, or is shaking hands with John Bruton, if you like, are the political descendants of the Irish benefactors of what took place in the 1840s.
Right, Ken Mulhern will be followed by Sean Quinn.
Yeah, well, this is going to echo in some ways what Chris has just said, because in many ways the measures that were taken in the aftermath of the famine to try and solve what the British called the land question continued to echo down through Irish politics for the next 100 years. And I think what it has for us today is it's a lesson for socialists, especially in the third world, who continue to think that there's a national solution rather than a class solution to the problems of hunger and poverty. Because what happens, what the British attempt to solve the land question amounted to in the last few years of the 19th century were a whole number of land acts which were passed, which allowed Irish farmers to buy land, Irish tenant farmers to actually buy their land from the landlords and use loans from the British government to do this. Now, when Irish independence was won in 1922, these loans continued to have to be paid back to the British government. They were called land annuities. Now, the middle-class farmers, many of whom were members of Fianna Fáil, the Irish Nationalist Party at the time, absolutely hated this. They detested the fact that they continued to have to pay money to the British government. And Fianna Fáil in the 1920s, which was actually out of power at the time, used this issue to try and curry favour amongst the middle-class farmers. Now, the important point for socialists is that at the very same time as they were currying favour with the middle-class farmers, they were also trying to pretend to Irish workers that they were the inheritors of the struggle for Irish freedom, and that a vote for them would be the best thing. For the working class. In fact, none of this was true. During the War of Independence, when Irish workers were occupying factories, raising the red flag over them and making their own working class demands, it was De Valera, the leader of Fianna Fáil, who actually told them Labour must wait. Now in the 1930s, what he did was he used the issue of the land annuities and the continued payments to the British government to wage an economic war with Britain. He said to Britain that he was going to refuse to continue to pay the land annuities. In fact, what De Valera did was he continued to collect the land annuities, but he didn't use the money that he collected to improve the lives of Irish workers. Far from it. In Ireland, right up until the 1950s, TB, tuberculosis, a disease that's associated with poverty, continued to be rampant. In other words, Fianna Fáil didn't do a bloody thing for the Irish working class. And right up to the present day, to be honest, unemployment, poverty wages continue to be rife in Ireland, proving that the nationalist solution represented by Fianna Fáil was no solution for Irish workers at all. But I'm glad to say, when we look at Ireland today and we see the fact that Fianna Fáil were voted out in 1992, a massive vote for the Labour Party, but more importantly still, workers are now beginning to fight back. We've seen a very successful strike in Duns. There's signs at last that the working class is sick and tired of waiting.
Right, I'm going to take Sean Quinn as the last contribution. I'm sorry to those who I haven't. I have got a couple of questions to read out as well.
Question, I just wanted to know, why was it that the British conquered Ireland? Why not France or Spain and stuff like that?
Thank you, Sean. The two other questions I've got is one from Anna Owens. Was there a British solidarity movement to oppose the export of food to Britain? And the other one is from Emmett Haverty Stack. The main driving force of British policy was to drive smallholders off the land and encourage capitalism. Just before I ask Pat to come back, there is a pamphlet here which is produced by the Irish Socialist Worker Movement, which is on sale on the way out, and that's £1. So, Pat, would you like to?
Yeah, very briefly, I think they'd have loved to have conquered France or Spain, but in fact they fought a whole series of wars with them, but the odds were somewhat different to the invasion of Ireland, which in a series and number of different occasions over a long period they did manage to conquer, a lot easier than had they tried to do so with France or Spain, who themselves were interested in conquering large parts of the earth. On the first of all, just on Willie Cumming, there's no question that the influence of the Catholic Church changes profoundly after the famine. No question about it at all, that there was a much looser relationship between the peasantry and the church before that. There wasn't anything like the same sort of control and hold over people's lives. And the material changes in that society that Willie described meant, particularly when it came to land inheritance and so on, gave the church a fantastic opportunity to intervene and build the sort of stranglehold that they helped. much longer. On the question of solidarity, the truth of the matter is that the one movement that had always shown great sympathy to the Irish question was the Chartists, who had had a high point and were in something of an ebb at the time, were to emerge again later, who had consistently supported the cause of Irish freedom. But there wasn't, in the sense that we would understand it, a sort of a mass don't let the food be imported movement. There was there were lots of charitable organisations, mainly religious, who did bring food over and so on, but the impact of that really was partly it was a let-off for the government, and partly it had about the same impact as Bob Geldof had in Ethiopia, to be honest. The truth of the matter is, it always fascinates me that the first thing that was called that Geldof formed was Band-Aid, which just about summed up the problem. That, you can't put a Band-Aid on a cut artery and it doesn't do anything, and in reality the levels of charity were not able to help in any way, shape or form. Actually, just to add insult to injury, there were certain wings of Protestantism who would only give you soup if you converted, which was, are you willing to become a Protestant for some soup? The amazing thing is that there are any Catholics left in Ireland, really, but, if I was given that choice, Protestant, yeah, me. Lots of people didn't, and I've met one or two people with very, very traditional Irish names in Southern Ireland who are Protestants, who we've often joked that their antecedents must have taken the soup. The two questions also that come out, one on the question of the free market politics and so on, because there's no question about it at all that if you listen to the lunacy of the Redwoods and the Portillos and so on, the famine is one very simple answer. When people actually implemented the sort of politics that they're talking about, then actually millions of people starved to death, sacrificed on the altar, so be it, of this economic orthodoxy. And you look at them, and it isn't just that Redwood looks completely stark, staring mad, particularly when trying to sing the Welsh national anthem, but also that it's an awful breed of politics which actually offers absolutely no solution to anyone except a privileged strata of society. And perhaps the one thing we should say, the real shame in the whole process, is how much, not of the more extreme nonsense, but how much of the nonsense Blair is prepared to go along with a set of economics that actually can never, ever solve the problems of ordinary working people, even if they don't be in the extreme situation of famine and so on and so forth. On the question, Chris is absolutely right about the question of the land. If you read the rising that I described that ends up in the Widow McCormack's cabbage patch, one of the things they found was that they got large numbers of people who would come out to march with them, all of them expecting food. All of them expecting food. And these people had no concept. So certainly that wing of Young Ireland, and actually most of them, had no concept. They couldn't understand. They began complaining. Oh, these people just want food. They don't want to, smash the British. They want food. Well, of course they were starving to death. Their families were starving. And to have no understanding, and the one person who really did have a clear understanding of the need to link the land question to the national question was Lawler. And although many people claim to support him, in reality, when it was put into practice, it was completely divorced, the social question and the national question, just as republicanism has always done ever since. The divorce of the social question and the national question, if you look in the period 1918 to 21, fantastic opportunities to actually link up with workers in struggle around social questions, occupation of the land and so on and so forth, occupation of factories, and again the Republican movement said no, we have to settle the question with Britain. And actually even modern day Republicans by and large would tell you that the social questions cannot be solved until the British go. And the reality is that they've now ended up talking to the very people who they said were the primary obstacle to solving the social questions and mixing with them. And they didn't do this out of some sort of blindness. They do it from a class position which really has never had as its starting point the interests of ordinary working people. Chris is quite right to say that the people who made up the bulk of the movement that that came into conflict in Britain with Britain between 18 and 21 were really, many of them, the people who had benefited out of the clearances of the land and whose own lands had grown during the famine of the Irish Catholic middle class. And therefore, I think we just need to finish by saying that actually nationalism provided no answer. Free market economics provided a disaster, and the unfortunate 2 million or so that died were the people who paid the price for those disasters.